Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar on newer treatments in SLE. My name is Jeanette Anderson, and I am the chair of Lupus Europe, and I'm an EPAC representative for SLE in ERN ReCONNET. Now, as you know, in the past decade, several new drugs for the treatment of SLE have reached clinical practice, which is very good. And in this webinar, we will introduce some new therapies and new drugs and explain how they work. Today's speaker is Dr. Maarten Limper from the Rheumatology and Clinical Immunology Department of the University Medical Center in Utrecht in the Netherlands. Dr. Maarten Limper is an internist and clinical immunologist. He's specialized in diagnosing and treating systemic autoimmune and autoinflammatory diseases with a focus on systemic lupus erythematosus, or SLE, and antiphospholipid syndrome, also called APS. Together with Professor Laurent Arnaud from Strasbourg in France, he is the current disease coordinator of the SLE group of ERN ReCONNET. Dr. Limper chairs the National Working Group on SLE and APS in the Netherlands and is a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Dutch Lupus Patient Organization. Besides his clinical work, Dr. Limper is leading several research projects in the field of both SLE and APS. His research is both fundamental, investigating inhibitory receptors such as CD200 and focusing on chemokine signaling in SLE, and translational, aiming to predict SLE flares and studying recurrent thrombotic events in APS. Now, today's webinar will be recorded and published on ERN ReCONNET's website and YouTube channel. For questions during the webinar, use the questions and answers session in the Zoom black bar on the bottom, or use the chat. Now, questions will be addressed to the speaker after the presentation, so don't worry, we will gather all your questions and I will present them to Maarten at the end. So, without further ado, I will ask you, Maarten, to please share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeanette, for this very kind introduction, and thanks to the ERN for this opportunity to talk to you. As you notice, I have a problem with my video, and I'm afraid I cannot solve this, so I'm clicking it on and off every once in a while, and well, I hope it's not bothering too much. I'll start sharing my screen. Let me see, it should be here. So if everything is working, you can now see my presentation.
Yep, we see it.
Thanks. And I see my video is frozen. Well, anyway, I will start talking. So today's talk will be about newer treatments for lupus. I will explain in a bit why it's not only new treatments, because I think some a bit older treatments are also interesting to talk about. It's going to be quite a technical presentation because I think this webinar is aimed at patients in the first place. So, but I thought it would be good to introduce you a bit into how doctors and researchers analyze studies, clinical studies with those new compounds that are now approaching us, already approached us, to give you a feeling why it's interesting or not, how to view newer treatments, because I think for a lot of people it's unclear how in the end those drugs reach the hospitals and you as patients. And because of that, it's rather technical. I will try to explain everything as good as I can. Hopefully I will manage to do so. And if not, we have plenty of time in the end for questions. So here we go. At least if my presentation is moving. There we go. Okay. So to start off, as many of you know, SLE, lupus, is a very heterogeneous disease. No single SLE patient is the same as another one. There's a lot of clinical heterogeneity. Also within patients, some people start off with only cutaneous involvement and then end up with renal inflammation and pleurisy and all those signs and symptoms that you can see. but also from an immunological point of view. So if you really look into the immune system, the different immune cells, it is all different per patient. And of course, this reflects the difficulties in finding the right treatment for the right patient. And if you think about how lupus starts, there's not one, in some situations, in some diseases, there's one gene or one cell involved, and you can just target that one gene or one cell, and you will have the solution for the problem. You have autoimmune diseases like thyroid disease, when there's one antibody that is really causing the inflammation, you can, for instance, block that antibody. In lupus, it's much more difficult, and that also explains why it's such a heterogeneous disease. And what you see here is a cartoon of different cells of the immune system. So you have the neutrophils in the upper left corner, macrophages, T cells, B cells, dendritic cells, all different types of immune cells that we all have, that are part of your immune system also in healthy conditions. But somehow in lupus, most of them are upregulated. They're too active and they're producing inflammatory proteins. So on the one hand, those antibodies that are depicted here in the red, the Y-shaped proteins produced by B cells, by plasma cells, but also a lot of inflammatory proteins like TNF, interleukins, for short IL, IL-6, IL-8, IL-17, also the type 1 interferon, the IFN that you see in the cartoon, all different proteins that are part of this cascade of inflammation. This is a large oversimplification of the immune system, but it helps to find targets to aim drugs at. So this is what we used to do in the past decades and still are doing, because it works very well for a lot of patients. So of course we advise patients to avoid sun exposure, to avoid UV light, because this is also one of the starting points of inflammation in lupus, because of the skin cells that are damaged by UV light and also start an inflammatory reaction. And we treat the inflammation with a lot of different drugs that we have known for most of them decades, all of them decades now. Of course, still with glucocorticoids, although they have a lot of side effects in higher dosages for longer periods, it's still a very potent immune suppressant drug that works actually on it says the complete immune system. So a lot of different cells are being suppressed, and it works quickly, it works well, but for the long term, it has a lot of side effects. So we need different drugs. Hydroxychloroquine, most of you will know, and probably most of you will also take it on a daily basis. It's more like an immune modulator. It's not immunosuppressant, but it changes the immune system in a beneficial way and prevents, to a certain extent, lupus flares. And then we aim at what we call the adaptive immunity with the drugs mentioned there, azathioprine, methotrexate, cyclophosphamide, mycophenolate or Cellcept, and the latter four mostly work on what they call the cell cycle. So it's the division of cells, and in this case, immune cells, is being hampered by those drugs, resulting in less inflammation. Luckily, this works very well for a lot of people in different combinations, sometimes more, sometimes less, but many patients are still being treated with these drugs that we've known. The good thing is that we know those drugs for a long time, so we have a lot of experience with them. We know what to expect for side effects and long-term problems. So this is good. But as many of you also will know, for some people, this is not working well enough or is not being tolerated well enough. So there is a clinical need for more drugs, for other drugs with different working mechanisms. And this is how they came up with this so-called immunotherapy. And what you see here in a slide from 2018, already, is in italic all different kinds of drugs. Again, you see different immune cells. In the middle, the B cells that are very often part of the inflammation in lupus have a central role, but also the T cells, different T cells, and other cells of the immune system. And all the italic words that you see are drugs that are targeting one of those either proteins, those inflammatory proteins, or one of the compounds on those cells called receptors. And by that, in a really direct, targeted way, try to block the inflammation in lupus. A lot of names that you see here, drug names, are still under investigation, are not part of clinical care, clinical practice right now. Some of them have already failed in the meantime, but others are still very interesting. And some of these drugs are really in clinical practice right now. And I will talk about two of them on this slide and a third one later on, because these are the newer drugs that I'd like to discuss today. So the first one is Belimumab, second Anifrolumab. The final part will be about Voclosporin. So Belimumab was already on this slide in the right upper corner. And what Belimumab does is it's blocking this cascade of antibody formation. So what you see here in the cartoon in the upper panel is like the normal situation without Belimumab. What you see is that there is this thing called bliss, the blue mushroom-like structure here. And so this is the healthy situation without Belimumab involved. And this bliss can bind to normal acting B cells. And those B cells start to mature and become plasma cells. And plasma cells can in the end produce proteins. And these are, for instance, proteins against COVID antibodies. So this is the normal situation. What you see in lupus is that those same B cells are autoreactive, which means they are not in the end maturing to become plasma cells and produce antibodies against COVID, but they produce antibodies, for instance, against DNA, and then we call them anti-double-stranded DNA, something your doctor will test on a regular basis to monitor your lupus activity. So this is the autoreactive B cell, the lupus B cell, and it's being stimulated by this protein called BLyS. It's like a growth factor for those cells. Belimumab just inhibits this mushroom-like structure, and by that, the BLyS cannot reach its target, cannot stimulate the B cell to mature, and the B cell will disappear, and you will not have those autoantibodies. So it makes sense to use this in an antibody directed approach for lupus. This drug is not so new, actually. It was in Europe. It was already approved in 2011 for patients with active lupus. And it's either intravenous or subcutaneous injections. So this is not so new. Why I included it in this presentation about newer drugs, and this is why it's newer drugs, is because of this. It's now also registered for the treatment of patients with renal involvement, so with kidney inflammation in lupus. And this is the hallmark study that was done already some years ago. And what you see is that there was this period of 104 weeks, so 2 years follow-up. Patients were included, so it were all patients with lupus with kidney inflammation. They all received what they call standard of care, so they had a good treatment already for their lupus. Most of those patients received Celsep, mycophenolate. Some of those patients received cyclophosphamide. And on top of that, they either received the investigational drug, Belimumab, or a placebo. So it looked the same. The doctor nor the patient knew whether it was Belimumab or a placebo. But of course, the placebo is not a working drug. It's only to be able to make a good comparison between the two arms. Patients were followed for 2 years. And after that, there was an extension study, but I will not talk about it. And because it was a kidney inflammation study, they looked closely at what they call kidney related endpoints. So they measured how much protein was still in the urine, because this is a sign of inflammation and you want to reduce that. They looked at kidney function in the blood, and they looked at how many patients needed what they called rescue medication, so courses of prednisone, of corticosteroids or other drugs to keep them in a good condition. And these are the main results. So what you see here is that they included 450 people almost all over the world, with a spread, a lot of patients from Asia, but also white and black people, mostly young women, as you would expect in lupus. And then you see here the placebo, so the fake drug people get versus Belimumab on top of standard of care. And you see a clear difference in what they call the partial renal response, so how well the kidney reacted on or how much the inflammation was reduced, and the complete renal response. So it's 32 in the placebo group, 32% versus 43 in the Belimumab, and also in the complete renal response, which is just a bit stricter measurement, 20% versus 30%. So they concluded that Belimumab as add-on on top of standard of care really improved the outcome for inflammation in the kidney in this study. And here you see the same, but then depicted over time. In black, it's all the time, it's the placebo group. In blue, it's the group with the investigational drug, Belimumab, and these are the same endpoints. So this is the partial renal response, and this is the complete renal response. And what you see is that those lines differ already starting after 12 to 16 weeks, and the difference stays all through those 104 weeks, indicating that Belimumab is of added value in those patients with lupus nephritis. This is way too much to read, not necessary to read, but of course you also want to know about side effects and safety. And so they looked at many aspects, mostly infections, but also other severe possible side effects, and there was no difference between the two groups in general. So it seemed a safe treatment with better outcome in the Belimumab group. So as of 2021, it's also registered as extra treatment for kidney involvement in lupus. But the research continues, and there is another strategy interesting to this extent, and that's the combination of another drug called rituximab, which is also aimed at the same B cell, so the in the end antibody producing cell, and the combination of those two drugs seems to be promising. There was another, the BLISS-BELIEVE study, clinical study, that showed negative results, but maybe that had to do with the selection of patients, and maybe in patients with high activity, a lot of inflammation. This is interesting to look at. So this is something that is being investigated right now, and we will hear the results probably in 2 years from now. Hopefully that will also give us another treatment possibility with the combination of those two drugs. Another drug that was already in this slide in 2018 is here in the middle, is called Anifrolumab. And Anifrolumab is directed against the interferon receptor on mostly T cells. Interferon is one of those proteins that are central in the inflammation of SLE. By blocking the interferon pathway, you would expect better outcomes, less inflammation. There were 3 large trials done before this new drug was registered. And what it does is it binds to the receptor of interferon, and by that not only it blocks the possibility of interferon to bind to its target, and after that it would normally activate this immune cell that is depicted here, but also the receptor, so the hook that it can bind to, is being what they call internalized, so it's not visible anymore. So even though the interferon production itself is still there, there's no target. It cannot bind and thus cannot activate the underlying immune cell. So again, very technical, but I will walk you through the slides. The 3 studies that were done, they were called the TULIP 1 and 2 and the MUSE study. What they did is a bit comparable to the first study I showed you. So these were patients with SLE in general, so not specifically lupus nephritis, but active inflammation. And what they did in the first study, they investigated 2 different dosages of Anifrolumab, 150 versus 300, and again with a placebo control. And in the TULIP 2, they did the same, but only with the 300 milligram dose. They included 450 people in the first study, 360 people in the second study. And then there was the treatment period, and they evaluated first at 52 weeks and again at 2 years. And these are the primary endpoints. And this is, again, it's very technical, but both the BICLA and the SRI are compound endpoints, and in a way reflecting disease activity in a broad sense. And what you can see here in this graph, so you have here the 3 studies, TULIP 2, TULIP 1 MUSE with this endpoint, and TULIP 2, TULIP 1 MUSE with the other endpoint. You see here in the yellowish orange, what is it, bars, this dotted line. If everything that is left from the line means that the placebo that was given was doing better than the Anifrolumab, and everything that's right from this line, the right side, tells you that Anifrolumab did better than placebo. And as you can see here, in almost all cases except for the TULIP 1 here, everything is on the right side, indicating that Anifrolumab is, in a broader sense, reducing inflammation in those studies. If you then look a bit more in detail, how that reflects, this is, for instance, the skin score in those patients. And what you see, again, in the lower line, it's the placebo, so the fake drug. And in the upper line, it's the Anifrolumab line over time. So it starts here at week 4. Already in week 8, week 12, you see a difference, which means that the skin involvement, because this is the CLASI, which is a measure of skin inflammation, is getting less in those patients treated with Anifrolumab. So more patients are responding. That's why the line is higher. And that accounts for both studies. And also, if you look at the joint score, so joint inflammation, you see in blue Anifrolumab, in gray the placebo. You see difference in the groups for joint involvement. So what they show here is that for lupus activity in general, measured by those compound endpoints, the BICLA and the SDI, but also if you look at the separate things like joints and skin, there's better results in those patients receiving Anifrolumab compared to placebo. And again, you need to look at the side effects and the potential risks. And here there is a difference, because we do see a lot of herpes, so skin infections in shingles in patients treated with Anifrolumab. That actually was the only real difference between the 2 groups, but an important one. Luckily, there is a vaccine available which works pretty well. So that is one of the advices to vaccinate people against herpes before starting this drug. For the rest, there were no important side effects. So this drug was approved for lupus in general, not only for lupus nephritis, last year. And for lupus nephritis, we don't know if it works well. Probably it has some added value, but we don't know what position that would be. And so this is still under investigation, and the trials are ongoing. So the final drug that is coming towards us now is a drug called Voclosporin. And this is another impossible cartoon, but again, you see a lot of cells, the T cells and the B cells and the plasma cells and the dendritic cells. This Voclosporin is directed against something in the internal machinery of those T cells, so certain inflammatory cells that are important in lupus. And if you look closer to where it works, so this is the outer layer of the cell membrane. The drug can go inside and it blocks this thing called calcineurin. And by that, the whole cascade is interrupted, and in the end, less inflammatory proteins are produced by those T cells, by those immune cells. It has another function. It also directly works on certain cells within the kidney, which is also beneficial if you look at lupus nephritis, kidney inflammation, because if these podocytes, those special cells in the kidney, are inflamed, then you see a lot of protein loss in the urine, which gives in itself damage to the kidney. And voclosporin stabilizes this podocyte function. So it works in two separate ways that are both important and interesting for the treatment of lupus nephritis. So it has been FDA approved. It's not yet on the market in Europe, but close to get there. So this is something we're waiting for. And it's because of these studies. So again, several studies were done to prove that these drugs are of added value. And again, so this is all about lupus nephritis. Again, it's kidney inflammation. Again, you see a placebo group. Also, so all patients had lupus nephritis. All patients were receiving Cellcept, mycophenolate. And then some patients were, again, getting placebo. And some patients were getting Voclosporin, the new drug, in different dosages. And what they saw is, so in this study, they included 265 patients with different types of renal involvement, kidney inflammation, all of them treated with mycophenolate, with Cellcept. And in the end, what you see is this is the placebo group after 6 months and after 12 months, and you see that about 20% was really improving for the kidney inflammation. But in the treatment groups, voclosporin in different doses, you see that this is much higher, approaching 50% in this group even. So clearly of added value in those patients. Let's skip this one. And then they did another follow-up study, which actually mimics the phase 2 study, the study I just showed, but then only with one dose of voclosporin. And again, they showed that the results were much better in the voclosporin group compared to the placebo group. So again, this is the measure of how much inflammation was still in the kidney, how much protein were people losing in the urine, how was the kidney function in the blood, how much prednisone did they need. And you see that there's a big difference in favor of voclosporin, the new drug. So, and this is the same results, but then in a more visual way presented with, again, a better result in the voclosporin group. It's the same results as the previous slide. And this is over time what happens. And you see that during treatment, the difference remains till the end of the study. So this is the 1 year result. Again, here, side effects, not really different from the placebo group. So no more infections, no extra infections, no other problems. So it seems to be a safe drug, safe treatment. So, and this brings me to the end of my presentation. What you see here is the last impossible slide that I will show you, just to show you that there's a lot of research going on. This is only for lupus nephritis. So again, kidney involvement. We've seen the TULIP the BLISS and the Aurora studies, but we have other studies still going on, all with different targets, different proteins, different receptors that are targeted. So new drugs are coming. Some of those studies will have negative results, as always, but some of those might have positive results, might have beneficial effect, and maybe will reach clinical practice in the upcoming years. So I would like to conclude by saying that what I've been showing you is 3 different drugs that I think are really of added value in the treatment of lupus in general and lupus nephritis, kidney involvement in particular. Please be aware that these drugs, because they are new, they're not necessarily better. This is something a lot of patients, but also doctors intuitively kind of feel, okay, it's new, or this is how our mind works, right? So if it's new, it's better. It's not necessarily true. I think I'm very happy with all these new drugs because, as I started off, every patient with lupus has somehow different disease, and it's the big trick to find the right disease for the right patient. And so it's really good that we have more tools, not necessarily better tools. Unfortunately, there's not this one drug that really works the best. But the more tools we have, the easier it becomes to find the right tool for the right patient. So if you're on azathioprine and you're doing pretty good, I think it's way better to stick to that than to try other new drugs because they're new. This is really not the way to go. But for those patients that are failing on like the conventional drugs, then it's really good to have more, and there's more coming. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Maarten. I think you really succeeded in explaining difficult scientific slides in an understandable way.
Thanks,
So
good to hear.
Much for that. So I have one question. We see also on your slides, and we know from the research going on that there's always a bit high placebo effect. So even if when a patient goes into this trial, it seems like they're getting better just by being in the trial, in the beginning at least. Mm-hmm. Do you have any speculations on why that is the case?
So the placebo effect is psychologically very interesting, and this is not only for lupus trials. This is in all medical trials, and I think in all scientific trials that you do with a placebo control. So there's psychology involved. How that works, nobody knows. I think partly it's also because in those clinical trials, people are really checked very often. So maybe the care is even better than in regular care. So yeah, I think, well, we know that psychology is an important factor in every chronic disease. And what I never understand, but still what's true, is that you can also in the placebo group, you will see less protein loss in the urine when people have kidney inflammation. How that works psychologically, I don't know. No. I think our mind is very strong, and we don't know half of it. I hope sometimes we will be able to use this in a beneficial way. For now, it's just a remarkable finding that we see in every trial. Yeah. And for the things like fatigue or feelings of depression, something like that, I can more easily understand that it works this way. But for like more objective findings like protein loss in your urine, I don't know how this works.
No.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah. So there's a question from Abdul Hamid, who says, Benlysta in patients with neuropsychiatric lupus and risk of depression. So I think it must be a question about what about neuropsychiatric lupus and an increased risk of depression when you are on Benlysta?
Yeah. So to start off with the latter, so when Belimumab came to the market in the first studies, there were signs or signals in mostly in the US that there might be an increased risk of depression and really suicide as well. So that's why in all follow-up studies, so this was in the first BLISS study, so the first registration studies, in all follow-up studies, this was followed very carefully with a lot of, so all patients that were taking part in those studies they needed to fill out depression scale lists every week. I think I was really often, because we were really scared that this was something serious. In the end, I think there's no evidence that people really have more depressive complaints when using Belimumab. So I think this has been really downsized. There was after all the data we gathered worldwide, if you analyze this, if you pull all those data, there is no signal that people are more depressed or more at risk for suicide. So I think that problem is, I don't know why it came out in the first place, but with all the data we have, I think we can slowly leave that behind us. And then for neuropsychiatric lupus, I think this is a very interesting field with a lot of people really suffering from, it's a wide term. It varies from depression to florid psychosis and everything in between, and also vascular problems causing hemorrhage and CVAs and things like that. So it's a wide concept, and we don't really know what the best treatment for neuropsychiatric lupus is. So what we mostly do, because it can be a very serious situation, we have most experience with like the older drugs, like cyclophosphamide is still, I think, used as the first choice in most patients. But I must say we treated some patients who, for instance, had a lot of cyclophosphamide in the past, and then you're a bit worried about toxicity, cumulative toxicity. We treated some patients with the combination of rituximab and belimumab with good effect, but it hasn't been trialed. It hasn't. We have no evidence that what is best in this situation. So I think it could have its place, but I think first we need to know more about neuropsychiatric SLE in the first place, because it's a lot of black box. It's difficult to know what's going on there and how to treat, and sometimes you need to treat with anticoagulation and not with immune suppression, and so there's a lot to do still.
Yeah, and it's difficult for those patients who have neuropsychiatric lupus that there aren't any clinical trials they can take part in, and there's no evidence that this works for it. So it is very much a case of trial and error also for doctors, right?
Yeah, it largely is.
What works.
Yeah, it largely is. For the trial that I shortly mentioned, the Symbiose trial, Symbiose 2, comparing rituximab combined with belimumab. This is maybe one of the first trials also including neuropsychiatric SLE patients, because in a lot of trials, those patients are excluded because it's too wide and too difficult to treat. And so, yeah.
So we have one from an anonymous person. Does Voclosporin work in extrarenal SLE manifestations?
Yeah, that's also a good question. It was mostly investigated for renal, as I showed you, but it's a potent T-cell inhibitor, so it inhibits part of the inflammatory cascade. So I do think that it does. It will find its role also in non-renal lupus, but there are no structured trials finished yet that can really tell us how it works, where it works. I must say that we use a lot of it's from the same group of drugs as, for instance, cyclosporin, which is way older, has more side effects. But this is a drug we use pretty often in lupus treatment, for instance, in patients who have the desire to become pregnant, because we know that it's safe in pregnancy. So this is one of the options during pregnancy. Voclosporin is really not proven to be safe yet in pregnancy, but probably it will.
It's still a new
it's too new
product. So
and of course all pregnant patients were excluded from the studies to be safe. But I can imagine that this will also be an interesting drug for non-renal lupus. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And then someone asked, can Anifrolumab be combined with Belimumab or rituximab? So having those newer drugs together, is that a possibility?
Yeah, well, technically and theoretically, this should be fine. At the same time, you're blocking different pathways of the immune system. So I would be a bit worried about the side effects, and particularly the infectious complications that you might get. But we do combine a lot of drugs already. This combination is probably people do it already somewhere around the world. We don't have any experience in our hospital, and I'm not aware of people that tried this combination. But it's in refractory cases. I think this would be a possibility, and so yeah. Again,
there's no contraindications to do it other than the increased risk of infections.
No, technically there's no contraindication. It's not that they work against each other or something. So it would be possible, but it's quite strong, I think. And yeah.
Should be enough to try one at a time, I think. So Alan asks, success rates in the various clinical trials remain rather low, often below 50%, even in the active leg. Some drugs do better with regards to that rate than others. How much can we compare those results across trials and say one is better than the others?
Yeah,
so
that's a very good and important question. Yeah. So in the ideal world, the thing is that the trials that I just showed you, all three trials or all three drugs, the larger trials were all done by the pharmaceutical companies. And of course, they have several interests. Of course, they do have an interest, luckily, to improve the life of lupus patients, and this is where it starts, but they also want to sell their drug. And of course, if there are two drugs at the same time, and one is a bit better than the other, and they come from different pharmaceutical companies, then the pharmaceutical company will be reluctant to test those two trials. They don't do it because this is not in their favor. This is not their business model. This is the harsh reality. So there's no way to really answer this question right now, and it's a very valid question, because in the end you want to know, and then again it's also patient dependent, because there's not one drug better than the other. One drug suits one patient better than the other, but we don't know how to find this out. So one thing what worldwide a lot of groups, including our group, are doing is trying to profile patients with lupus to find out what kind of signature they have, what kind of pathway is the most important in their lupus, and with what drug can you really target the inflammation in this patient. So this is one thing. And the other thing is with the older drugs, we actually need to wait for comparison studies to know what is better, what is more potent, and for that, so you need to wait until a patent is over, because then things become cheaper, and then we can investigate or initiate it. We can do those trials. But the positive, so this will take time, but the positive thing is that there is a huge treat to target study starting, or has already started, and there. This is all about finding the right drug for the right patient and trying to individualize treatment. And in the end, this is the most important. So it doesn't matter which drug is in general on a group level is the most potent drug. It's important what drug is the right drug at that time for that patient.
So there's a future for biomarkers, hopefully, to give us more answers on which drug will work in which patient. You show that Anifrolumab is especially successful when it comes to skin manifestations. So Anne-Marie is asking, should skin improvement be included as a secondary endpoint in research? It is often shown that the skin improves in clinical trials, but as a drug is approved for SLE, it will not be approved for skin lupus at the end. So to have skin lupus as an end goal by itself.
Yeah, but this is two different things. I think so. I think about 90% of patients with systemic lupus, with SLE, also have skin involvement. But then there is this separate group of people with skin lupus, with cutaneous lupus, and the problem is that it really resembles each other. You can, if you take a biopsy, it looks the same. But it's different entities, and most of patients with cutaneous lupus, only skin lupus, will never have renal involvement, will never have systemic inflammation. Only a minority will develop systemic lupus, and most of those people develop it within the first year after diagnosis. So in a way, it's different diseases. And if you look at how these trials that I just showed you and other SLE trials are being done, it's really patients with systemic lupus. And a lot of those patients do have cutaneous involvement. So in those studies, and I showed you the CLASI scale in the Anifrolumab study, skin is one of the secondary endpoints for sure. So the CLASI was one of the secondary endpoints as a measure of skin activity. But still, it's systemic lupus with a good result on skin. And this is not the same as cutaneous lupus. This is another group of people. And I must say that if you look at the studies being done, it's mostly SLE, it's mostly systemic lupus, which is, of course, not so good for the people with cutaneous lupus as a separate entity. But you cannot directly extrapolate those findings in SLE to cutaneous lupus. At the same time, those studies are being done right now, and we will have results, and I can imagine that Anifrolumab also for cutaneous lupus will be standard of care at a certain point. But for now, it's all SLE data.
Yeah. Thank you. So Amy is asking, should or has Voclosporin been directly compared to other CNIs instead of rather than MMF by itself? So
that's
do you know?
Yeah, this is a bit comparable to Alain's question.
Yeah,
those head-to-head comparisons is actually what you would like to see, and they're not doing it, because if they show that the good old Voclosporin or tacrolimus, which is also kind of the same drug, maybe is equal or maybe even better than Voclosporin, then their market is gone. So they don't do it, and so we don't know right now. I think no, I was going to say that maybe it is better, but actually we really don't know. What we do know is that the comparison for side effects with cyclosporin, from a clinical point of view, then Voclosporin is has much less side effects. That is something I think we know if you compare just from clinical practice, if you compare those drugs. But if it's more potent, I don't know. And again, these studies are needed, but will not be performed in the hands of the pharmaceutical companies because it's not in their interest.
No. So now we have it approved. So now we move on to a different thing. Yes.
Yeah.
So someone asks, regarding sequential combination with biologics in refractory SLE and lupus nephritis, what are the key points to consider for efficacy and safety on the basis of the data already published? So I don't know if you know that, but
I don't know if I really understand the question well. So if this is on a per patient, so there's a difference between what you want to do in a trial, because then you look at group level and compare those groups, or on an individual basis. And I think this question is more about personal individual basis, right? I think if I interpret it well.
I'm not sure, but I think so, yes.
Yeah, so then again, it depends on a lot of factors. So we have the more objective. So as a clinician, I mostly for renal lupus, I mostly focus on, of course, kidney function, but this is the last thing you want to see go down, because then it's really not good. And before that, it's mostly proteinuria, so protein in the urine that you can easily measure. So this this is one of the important factors. But of course, there's most patients with renal involvement in lupus also have other complaints and maybe also other inflammatory problems that you can measure. So we look at the complement levels, C3 and C4 levels. We look at the antibody levels, the anti-double strand DNA. We look at the amount of white blood cells. Is there anemia? What are the platelets? But of course, in the first place, how is somebody doing? And you try to combine all those things. So if you really, I'm not a nephrologist, I'm an immunologist. If you ask a nephrologist, it's all about protein and kidney function. And if that's okay, then it's not nice for my nephrology colleagues, what I'm saying now. And of course, they look at the patient and they treat the patient as a whole, but they're really focused on the kidney. And I think if you want to point out what's most important in renal involvement, then they are right. It's protein and in the end kidney function.
Yeah. So we have a lot of questions, but I have one last one for you, and I'm sure you can answer all the other questions after this meeting. But my final question is: so now you've presented some new drugs. We know some others are in the pipeline and some other compounds. We even saw some on your slide. So if you were to say which new upcoming compound you think is the most promising, what would that be? And you can choose several if you want to. But...
Well, they were not on the slide. I think this CAR T cell story is the real, hopefully the real breakthrough. Probably a lot of people in the call have heard something about it. So this is a quite new technology where you can really train the immune cells to. So what you do, you take out those T cells from patients, and in a laboratory you kind of train them to work as immunosuppressant drugs. So it's the patient's own T cells that are being infused again after training in the lab, and then they so in this case they targeted those B cells that I showed you. So in a way it's the same what we do with drugs like rituximab and Belimumab, but in a way more potent way. So the patient, and this was a very small study in 5 patients in Germany. But those patients were really refractory. They had a lot of pre-treatment, nothing worked. And then with this treatment, until now, it looks like their lupus is solved. So nobody can say that it's really over, but for now, and I don't know, the follow-up is, what is it? Maybe it's not so long yet. It's 1 year or maybe a bit longer.
Yeah, for some of them it's a bit longer, yes, but for the last ones it's only 1 year. So
but it's incredible results for the first year. So really all those things that you can measure in lupus, even if it's clinically not active anymore, most of the time you still see that people have low complement and still have anti-double strand DNA as signs of immune activation. And in those patients it was all turned around. So I think this is really promising. So hopefully this will be developed, and this now in the end, I think this is one of the goals of Lupus Europe, right? To solve lupus. Well, so if I have to take a bet, I think this one is for now is the most interesting.
Yeah, and unfortunately it's very expensive at the moment, and it's still on the experimental stage. But
it is. Don't go ask your doctor for this, because it's not something we can do in clinical practice. Also not in my center, but this is, well, hopefully this is the breakthrough that we need, and as it looks now, it looks promising.
Yeah, and we'll definitely keep an eye on it and keep everyone informed about what happens. So I think we're running out of time. I just want to thank you, Maarten, for your very great presentation and for answering all these questions. For all of you people out there who have asked questions that hasn't been answered yet, we will give them to Maarten afterwards, and hopefully you will send a small reply to each and every one of you. So thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks all for being with us.